Hello. In today's ethical dilemma in science, what we're going to look at is going to be a doctor's dilemma. And this is a real life example that we're going to examine in a couple different ways. And the overall question we have is when, if ever, is it appropriate to use tainted data that's been collected in a potentially unethical way in order to save a patient? And so, as I said, this is a real life example. And so looking at the considerations associated with the surgeon who was working with a 50-year-old patient who had undergone several knee replacement surgeries, and in the process of these knee replacements had built up a fairly significant amount of scar damage, scar tissue damage within this region, resulting in the saphenous nerve being pinched in this area. And the pinching of this nerve was so incredibly painful that she asked that the surgeon amputate her leg if the surgeon was not going to be able to release the pinched nerve, basically release the tissue associated with causing the pain associated with this pinched nerve. Now, during the surgery, the surgeon basically opened it up, kind of like the image we've got here on this slide, and basically could not trace the branches of the nerve through this accumulation of muscle and connective tissue. And surgeons basically, you don't want to be cutting things that you can't see. You want to be able to kind of isolate and see everything that's going on in a region before you go through and cut it. The carpenters say measure twice, cut once, and that's with the board. What is a surgeon going to do if they can't see what it is that they're working with? Now, normally what's going to happen is that the surgeon will often refer an anatomical map, a book of anatomical drawings that will show kind of the normal kind of placement of these structures, in the case, the nerve. The problem was the most commonly used atlases aren't detailed enough to be able to trace the branches of this nerve in the area that she's working with. And the surgeon was basically operating blind with what was available. However, she did have access to another atlas, a much more detailed atlas that would potentially provide the information he needed in order for the successful surgery and potentially a pain-free outcome for her patient. But the question becomes, should she use that more detailed atlas, because it's mired in an incredible ethical controversy? And so from that kind of setup, we're going to look at a couple examples and then come back to this. Now, the ethical considerations associated with this are coming out of wartime. And so the question is, what occurs at war? We've got conflict, we've got loss of life on both sides, but even more than that, what we often see is that in times of conflict and times of war, we end up in an us versus them mentality. And in doing so, we often dehumanize our opponents. We see that in times of war. Sadly, we see that in times of civil controversies, civil disagreements, things like that, in which, with our efforts to, not fight against the person's idea, but to fight against the person, or to really denigrate the person with those opposing viewpoints. Now, in this, we've got three artist renditions of posters at times of war. We've got one with a German ape with the nice hat coming out of World War I. The second looking at a Japanese soldier in World War II. Both of these really dehumanized in the way they're being represented. We take a look at it, they look, potentially evil, doing bad things. In both of these cases, they're carrying a partially unclad woman. Again, the protective nature of society is to protect the vulnerable. And so basically this is saying, there are these evil people out there that we must beat in this time of war. And in contrast, we'll look at the last image. You've got an American soldier from World War II, again, carrying a human, but in this case, carrying an infant in a nurturing and protective way. And so, pulling at our heartstrings, be supportive for the American soldier as they fight this dehumanized artist rendition of a German or a Japanese soldier in terms of conflict. So the question becomes, what is the role of a scientist during a time of war? What obligations do scientists have when they are, in a society that is faced with conflict and faced with a need to address that conflict? So a couple different examples, and I kind of describe these as kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly. The first one, the potentially good, and I'm not sure if any of these are good or bad. It's a subject for debate as we consider these ethical things. But here we've got, and I'm mispronouncing this, Sturmbannführer Wernher von Braun. Basically, Sturmbannführer is an SS officer rank, roughly equivalent of a major within the U.S. Army. Von Braun was a member of the Nazi Party, and he basically led the development of the German V-2 rocket. These V-2 rockets, these Vengeance rockets, were capable of carrying 2,200-pound warheads, a ton of warhead in essence, to a target about 200 miles away. And now estimates vary, but it's pretty good evidence that there were at least several thousand, upwards to 9,000, maybe in the low, tens of 10,000 or so people, civilians and soldiers, that were killed in these V2 attacks, primarily in Britain, but also other areas of Europe as well. We take a look at the assembly plants in creating these rockets, building these rockets. They use slave labor, oftentimes using concentration camp prisoners, and it's estimated that about 12,000 laborers and concentration camp prisoners died in the construction of these missiles. Now, ultimately, von Braun was arrested by the Gestapo towards the end of the war because he made some careless remarks about the way the war was going. But ultimately, von Braun and many of the scientists that were with him surrendered to the American forces at the end of the war. And as part of Operation Paperclip, they worked at developing rockets for the U.S. Army. After working with the U.S. Army for a number of years, von Braun joined the newly formed NASA and worked as basically the director of the NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, which was involved with building and testing and making the rockets that were necessary to take the astronauts to the moon. Over time, von Braun, as we can see here in this slide, was on the cover of Life magazine, the cover of Time magazine. He was a spokesperson for a Walt Disney television program on space travel called The Man in Space. And as I said, he developed the rockets that put the man on the moon. And so potentially, bad use of his science for the construction of V-2 rockets and, in a time of war, potentially good use in terms of construction of rockets for taking man into space. Taking a look at our second example, if von Braun is a good, German SS doctor Sigmund Rascher is going to be an example of bad. He conducted deadly experiments on prisoners. He did things like taking a look at the effects of altitude. And so we would use an Air Force pressure chamber, put prisoners in it, and basically expose them to low levels of oxygen as if to simulate what a pilot would be exposed to. In this diagram, he's looking at hypothermia. So what happened if a pilot got out of their plane because the plane's being shot down and is submerged in ice water? How long were they able to survive? What ways could we rewarm them? He did, again, Rascher did some pretty good, well-designed experiments that were often viewed as valid science going up into the 1990s. But these were fatal experiments on prisoners in the system. He did coagulation experiments, so looking at blood clotting agents, in which he basically had prisoners shot and looked at the bleeding process and took concoctions and put them in an effort to stem the bleeding. Ultimately, Like von Braun, Rascher was arrested towards the end of the war. He was actually arrested for kidnapping children that he would later claim that it be his own. He was sent to a concentration camp and actually executed by the Germans prior to the American liberation in 1945. So that was the bad. Now we're getting over into the ugly. Austrian professor Edward Pernkopf was an anatomist working at the University of Vienna. He was a professor there for a number of years, dean of the medical school, rector for a period of time during World War II. But his claim to fame, in essence, was spending over 20 years preparing a very highly detailed atlas of human anatomy. And in this slide, we've got Pernkopf in the darker suit surrounded by 4 technicians who served as artists on his project. And so if we look at it, the Netter Atlas on the left-hand side is the traditional atlas used, at least in the United States, for the study of medicine, and is a resource that surgeons use. On the right-hand side is a comparable page out of the Pernkopf and atlas. And you can see it is much more detailed. It has a much more elaborate dissection of the tissues and a much more elaborate description about what's going on in these various muscles and nerves and blood vessels. Now, if we take a look at Pernkopf, and again, getting to the ugly aspect of this, an investigation by the University of Vienna in the mid-1980s started to look at this. And what they learned was probably known, but not well known at the time, was that Pernkopf was an active member of the National Socialists. He was a Nazi at the University of Vienna. He joined the Nazi Party Foreign Organization in 1933. In his time as leader, as dean of the medical school, he fired Jewish professors after the time that Nazi Germany annexed Austria. And also, if they started looking at the work, at his signature accomplishment, is this atlas, Pernkopf's atlas. What they were able to determine is that the drawings were, at least in part, based on the dissections of people executed by the Nazis. And if that wasn't bad enough, the images were stylized. They were including Nazi swastikas and the double lightning bolt of the SS in these drawings, if you look in very elaborate detail at this. Later, the SS symbols and the swastikas were airbrushed out, but the Nazi influence was present in the drawing, and the ugly part of it is that the subjects of the drawings were executed people. Now, in terms of his kind of outcome, Pernkopf died after the war, about 10 years after the war, but he was still at the University of Vienna, and he was still working on that atlas at the time of his death. Now, in the aftermath of the investigations, the publisher of the atlas, it was a very popular atlas up until that time, discontinued the book and ceased reprinting it. Libraries that had it in their collections began restricting the use of it, just to take it out of common circulation. But thousands of copies remained in private collections, and you can still find them on the used book market. And that's part of what happened here, is that the surgeon in question was given this atlas as a gift because of the value it had for somebody doing these very delicate surgeries, these nerve surgeries that she was doing. And so the question is, again, that ethical question, can you derive good from evil? Should the surgeon refer to this atlas that has been collected in a very unethical way in order to save the patient's leg? Now, the surgeon and her colleagues referred to ethicists and other clinicians, and they actually wrote a peer-reviewed article that appeared in the scientific journal Surgery in 2019, talking about this case and talking about what they were able to learn by talking with different ethicists and thinking about the different viewpoints. So more questions that you can consider related to this is, how do you protect research subjects from unethical research? When is it permissible, if ever, to use tainted data which has been collected in unethical ways? The Rasher data on hypothermia was used up until the 1990s. Other examples of other wartime research has been used in a variety of settings. Doesn't matter if you're going to be using the data, if it's to save a life, or if it's just to improve the quality of life of an individual or group of individuals. Doesn't matter if it's not saving a life, but it's mildly beneficial to a small number of people. Doesn't matter if we are using these resources solely to advance science understanding of a topic, and in this case, the topic would be kind of the anatomical organization of the leg. So again, the doctor's dilemma, a real-life example faced by a surgeon relatively recently. But the question is, how do we come about with an agreement, or at least an understanding, about some of these really challenging ethical issues related to science? Thank you, and have a great day.